This is the Mop Up. I'm David Feldman in New York City. Thank you so much for joining me. It's a beautiful day here in New York City and most of America, which is under an orange cloud this evening. I'm not talking about Donald Trump. 135 wildfires raging in Ontario, Canada, and it's sending thick smoke into parts of America, including the Northeast and the Midwest. New York City's mayor, Zohran Mamdani, telling 8 million constituents to stay indoors, which couldn't come at a worse time for New York City because we're right in the middle of explosive diarrhea season. Everyone knows much of New York City's $31 billion tourism industry centers on people coming to New York City to sample our world-famous explosive diarrhea. By the way, when is diarrhea not explosive? Donald Trump has great diarrhea. You know, they named Lou Gehrig's disease after Lou. They should name explosive diarrhea after Trump. He wants everything named after him. He doesn't have a disease. I can't come into work. I ate something and I got Trump. Oh, don't come in. We don't want to catch it. Trump's nominee for Attorney General, Todd Blanche, can't afford to lose one single Republican vote on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Otherwise, his name will not be brought before the Senate for a full vote. North Carolina Senator Thom Tillis, who likes to portray himself as a maverick who's unafraid of standing up to Donald Trump, he said he wouldn't vote for Blanche at a committee until Blanche agreed to meet with some of Jeffrey Epstein's victims. Blanche said he would. So Thom Tillis, standing up to Donald Trump. Very brave man, Thom Tillis. He's leaving the Senate after this year. He announced his retirement right after his office was inundated with death threats when he said he might not vote to confirm Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. Had Tillis voted no, Hegseth would have gone down to defeat. And Tillis, you might remember, met with Hegseth's former sister-in-law, who claimed Hegseth beat his second wife. So Tillis promised her he wouldn't vote for Hegseth unless Hegseth's sister-in-law was allowed to testify before the Senate. Well, she wasn't allowed to testify, but Thom Tillis, maverick, not afraid to stand up to Donald Trump, voted for Pete Hegseth anyway. You know, because of the death threats. All it took was Thom Tillis to vote no, and Pete Hegseth would not be our defense secretary right now. But Thom Tillis is so busy rewriting history on his way out of the Senate, you know, hand-wringing, saying, I'm not afraid to stand up to Donald Trump. Such a great man, Thom Tillis. His phone number at the Capitol is 202-224-6342. Senator Thom Tillis's number is 202-224-6342. Leave a polite message for Senator Thom Tillis, reminding him he's responsible for Pete Hegseth. All he had to do was vote no on Pete Hegseth, and he chickened out. And now, if he votes yes to get Blanche out of the committee and onto the floor, he's responsible for Todd Blanche pretty much becoming permanent Attorney General. So call Thom Tillis's office at 202-224-6342 and politely leave a message, politely reminding him he's personally responsible for Pete Hegseth, which he is. So all you have to do is vote no on Todd Blanche. Todd Blanche doesn't make it out of the committee, and then he's only acting Attorney General for the next basically 2 years. So this is just a vote to make him the permanent Attorney General. Senator John Cornyn is the Texas Republican who lost his primary after Trump endorsed Ken Paxton, who's currently in Europe vacationing with his mistress. And Cornyn, like Tillis, hinting, maybe I'm open to voting for Todd Blanche, maybe I'm not. He's voting for him. John Cornyn will wring his hands, pretend he's not voting for Todd Blanche, but he'll vote him out of committee because John Cornyn is leaving the Senate and he wants money once he leaves, and you don't make money if you stand up to Donald Trump. Well, some interesting news. Donald Trump's teleprompter operator has agreed to settle with regulators, accusing him of winning $100,000 on Kalshi, placing bets as to what Trump would say in his speech moments before delivering it. You can place those kind of bets on Kalshi. His name is Gabriel Perez, and he reportedly made wagers on the words and countries Trump would mention in his speech. And Perez, Trump's teleprompter operator, apparently was placing bets based on an advanced copy of Trump's speech that was being fed into the teleprompter. Trump reportedly very ashamed because now we know he needs a teleprompter. Donald Trump needs a teleprompter. Well, Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary, announced all members of our military over the age of 30 must submit to mandatory screening for levels of testosterone. They want to make sure our soldiers' testosterone is high. This is all part of Hegseth's new plan entitled Operation Could We Be Any More Obvious? See, I don't think the problem with our Pentagon these days is too little testosterone. Don't think that's the problem. It's like saying the Trump administration has a shortage of stupid, abusive, impotent white men. Yeah. Well, Secretary of State Marco Rubio convened a meeting of 67 foreign ministers from around the world so that he and Stephen Miller could convince them the biggest threat to civilization is far-left terror, Antifa. According to Marco Rubio, Stephen Miller, and Donald Trump, all the world's foreign ministers must wake up to the threat from Antifa, from far-left terrorists. You know, the biggest threat to the world actually is Marco Rubio, our Secretary of State, who, as head of U.S. aid, has cut spending on food and life-saving medications nearly in half, resulting so far in the deaths of nearly 1 million people around the world, mostly women and children. Yeah, last time I checked, it wasn't Antifa blockading the Strait of Hormuz or making it impossible for 30% of the world's fertilizer to reach Asia and the sub-Saharan, exacerbating a famine Rubio chooses to ignore. Marco Rubio, as our Secretary of State, has the authority to deport anyone for any reason, and he just ordered the deportation of Colombian activist Beto Corral, not because of any crime other than supporting a candidate for president of Colombia that Marco Rubio and Donald Trump didn't support. So Beto Corral, as we speak, is being flown out of the country, sent back to Colombia where it's not dangerous for him. He was arrested by ICE in late June. He has spent roughly 3 weeks in ICE detention, which mercifully comes to an end on Thursday night when he is being flown back to Colombia, where he now faces the danger of retribution because his candidate, who he supported in the presidential race last month, lost by 1% to Donald Trump's favored candidate. Beto Corral lived in the United States for 10 years. He came here after his father, Humberto Corral, was murdered. Many say because he was the police captain involved in the capture of noted drug dealer Pablo Escobar. So Corral arrested here in the United States. Why? Because, according to our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, Corral espoused public opinions that Marco Rubio deemed were contrary to U.S. foreign policy interests. So you support the candidate Donald Trump doesn't want to be president of Colombia, you are thrown out of here. You're a threat to national security, according to our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who has so far the blood of 1 million people on his hands for his nearly 40% cuts in U.S. aid. Marco Rubio, craven individual. This is the same Marco Rubio who arranged for ICE to begin sending detainees, including Abrego Garcia, to that torture chamber in El Salvador. Rubio testified before the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee that Abrego Garcia was, quote, a human trafficker and a gangbanger. That is a lie. And Maryland Democrat Senator Chris Van Hollen called Rubio a coward for saying that. He said, you would never dare make that statement about Abrego Garcia in a federal courtroom under oath. Well, this week, Marco Rubio published an opinion piece on the State Department's Substack, as well as inside the Wall Street Journal. It was entitled, Why We're Dismantling the ICC. That would be the International Criminal Court. Why? Why would Marco Rubio announce the dismantlement of the International Criminal Court? And since the United States is not a signatory to the ICC, how can you dismantle something you don't belong to? So why is Marco Rubio going to dismantle the ICC? Because he and the rest of the Trump White House, after they return to private life, want to be able to travel to places like Europe, Central America, South America without getting arrested. Marco Rubio, who has the blood of 1 million people on his hands because he has slashed U.S. aid by 40%, Marco Rubio claimed in his article that the International Criminal Court is, quote, waging war against the United States. Well, how are they waging war against the United States? According to Marco Rubio, by attempting to enforce international law. That's how the ICC, and he put that in writing. He said, the ICC is waging war against the United States by attempting to enforce international law. You know, the statutes that say you can't fire on alleged narco-terrorists just because you have reason to suspect their boat might be carrying drugs. You know, you can't make it impossible for refugees to seek political asylum within your own borders. You're not supposed to make them stand outside the border in Mexico and ask for an asylum hearing. You're supposed to bring them in and give them an asylum hearing. Oh, and you can't bomb a sovereign nation like Iran or Yemen. You can't bomb civilians like we did in Yemen and Iran. You can't blockade a strategic waterway like Hormuz. Now, the United States is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, but Marco Rubio knows that doesn't mean he or Hegseth or Stephen Miller can't be arrested while traveling to one of the 125 countries that are signatories, especially if you committed war crimes against countries that are signatories. Marco Rubio knows this. That's why he's desperately trying to dismantle the ICC before Donald Trump gets rid of him. Our country doesn't have to be a signatory to the ICC. All we have to do is commit a war crime against a country that is, and the people who masterminded that war crime, it's going to be hard for them to travel to any of the 125 countries that are signatories. For example, just off the top of my head, Rubio is the de facto viceroy of Venezuela. There was a big story in the New York Times earlier this week. He's running Venezuela. They can't spend money unless it goes through Marco Rubio. Now, you know that's criminal. And Venezuela, by the way, is a signatory to the International Criminal Court. So not Venezuela, we took Maduro. Also signatory to the International Criminal Court is the nation of Colombia. Now, a lot of our airstrikes targeting the so-called narco-terrorists, they turned out to be fishermen from either Venezuela or Colombia. That's according to Nicolas Maduro before we grabbed him in January, and Gustavo Petro, the left-wing president of Colombia, whose term ends on October 7th, where he will be replaced by a Trump-supported right-wing authoritarian in the model of Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro. That's who Trump wanted to win, and he won, not Petro's candidate. And that's why Marco Rubio deported Pedro Corral, because he supported the progressive populist who was running for president of Colombia, right? So the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, he leaves office in the first week of August. He accused the Trump administration of war crimes, of killing innocent fishermen with all these illegal airstrikes in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. They're illegal. They're war crimes. By every definition of a war crime, those strikes on those alleged narco-terrorists, especially the one where they went back for seconds, where our military saw survivors and they were told, kill them all. Those are war crimes. It's not to be debated. And the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, said so. Said, these aren't just war crimes. They're not even Venezuelan. Many of them are Colombian, and they're just fishermen. So in October of last year, Donald Trump didn't like what Colombia's president Gustavo Petro was saying. So Donald Trump in October of last year warned Petro has a, quote, fresh mouth towards America. And then Trump repeatedly threatened to invade Colombia and arrest Gustavo for dealing drugs, the same way he did with Nicolas Maduro. Nice, right? Rubio also banned Gustavo from visiting the United States. Why? What crime did Gustavo commit other than speaking the truth about these illegal extrajudicial airstrikes in the Eastern Pacific and the Caribbean? He's the president of Colombia, and he has reason to believe American military is killing Colombian fishermen, and he's just supposed to keep his mouth shut? Nice. Rubio also banned the Brazilian Supreme Court justice who oversaw the conviction of Jair Bolsonaro. Remember him? The former Brazilian president who was convicted last year of attempting to overthrow his government after losing re-election in 2022 and then in 2023 before Lula was sworn in. Bolsonaro was convicted of plotting a coup d'etat, plotting to kidnap and kill the current president, Lula, as well as a Supreme Court justice. Many of you saw the video from January 8th, 2023. That's who Rubio is defending right now. Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, punishing the prosecutors who brought him to justice. Bolsonaro found guilty, serving nearly 30 years for doing on January 8th, 2023, what Trump tried to do 2 years earlier on January 6th. So they've made it clear this is a White House that supports either fascists or authoritarians, like Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. He is a fascist. He runs a dungeon where we've sent Abrego Garcia and other innocent immigrants to. And Rubio arranged that. Early on in 2025, they made a deal to pay El Salvador several $1 million a year to house our immigrants in a torture chamber. Nayib Bukele. And Rubio supports Abelardo de la Espriella, who is soon to be the new president of Colombia, far right-wing businessman. Trump likes him because he hasn't even become president yet, and already he's acting like Bolsonaro. They support Viktor Orban, who went down to defeat earlier this year in Hungary. Rubio went to Hungary to campaign for Viktor Orban this year. Viktor Orban, right-wing, authoritarian, proto-fascist. Okay? In December of 2025, Trump pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was serving 45 years for pushing hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States while serving as the authoritarian leader of Honduras from 2014 to 2022. His rule as president was deemed a narco dictatorship. That's what it was called, a narco dictatorship. It was repressive. He stole elections, and of course, there were the mass arrests of dissidents. But Trump liked him. So when Hernandez was convicted by the Biden Justice Department in 2024, found guilty of conspiracy to ship hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States, Trump immediately called it a witch hunt. And then, last year, pardoned him. So while Trump was authorizing illegal airstrikes against alleged narco-terrorists, who we know weren't, he was busy pardoning the fascistic former president of Honduras, right, who was serving time 45 years for pushing hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States. Juan Orlando Hernandez pardoned. We know he was and is an actual narco-terrorist. He gets pardoned. The fishermen get killed. And, of course, this was done, the pardon came right before or as Trump was ginning up an invasion of Venezuela, accusing Nicolas Maduro of narco-terrorism. So on January 6, Trump told his mob of armed goons that Joe Biden stole the presidency. We all know what happened. we all know that he lost 60 court challenges before January 6. But he told his armed goons, you need to march down to the Capitol and fight like hell, or we won't have a country anymore. And they did, as they were told. Trump sat in his West Wing watching an insurrection unfold on Fox News while eating a hamburger, refusing to call in the National Guard to rescue his own vice president, the entire Congress, our Capitol Police, and our government. Frantic calls and text messages from Trump's closest friends and relatives flooded the Oval Office. Then Republican Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, under siege, fearing for his life, screamed on the phone at Trump, stop this. Tell them to stop. Call in the National Guard. Trump wouldn't do it. Donald Trump would not do it. Cabinet officials, Don Jr., Ivanka, and most importantly, Sean Hannity, all called and warned this has gone too far. But Donald Trump ignored these friends and allies, insisting, the people storming the Capitol right now, they're angry, and there's really nothing I can do about it. It was the vice president, Mike Pence, who was secreted to a hideaway inside the Capitol building. He was unwilling to accept the protection from Donald Trump's own Secret Service for fear, reportedly, he feared they would turn him over to Donald Trump. It was Mike Pence who pushed then acting Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller to call and activate the Washington, D.C. National Guard. What we saw on January 6 was something resembling an invocation of the 25th Amendment, where the President of the United States had clearly been incapacitated, frozen, incapable of performing his constitutionally prescribed duties to defend and protect the United States. So his second in command, General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the acting director of the Pentagon, they assumed control and ordered in the National Guard. Trump's speech on the ellipse that day, where he ordered his followers to storm the Capitol, ended at 1:15 p.m. His MAGA goons completely breached the barricades by 2:10. Windows by 2:10 were already broken. Reports of looting, reports of members of Congress evacuating were already filling the TV screens by 2:10. And yet it took Donald Trump another 30 minutes to tweet the words, "Stay peaceful." He didn't call up the National Guard. He didn't rush down to the White House press room and call on his goons to stop. All he could summon was a tweet that said, "Stay peaceful." So you've seen the footage from January 6. Nobody inside the Capitol, none of these guys were checking their phones for a tweet from the president, because he had already ordered them to fight like hell, so they knew what to do. Not until 4:20 p.m., nearly 3 hours after the insurrection began, 1 hour after the National Guard was activated by Mike Pence, not until 4:20, 3 hours after the insurrection began, did Donald Trump finally record a televised message urging his MAGA goons to head on home, saying, I love you. Yes, the election was stolen, but now you have to go home. The very definition of too little, too late. And as the sun set that day, Trump headed back to the private residences. And we know from the January 6th committee that the very last thing Donald Trump said to his staff was, quote, Mike Pence really let me down today. That was his takeaway. After all that happened on January 6th, his summation to his staff was, Mike Pence really let me down that day. Because in Trump's fevered mind, he was the victim. He was the victim. Mike Pence failed him. We all saw what happened on January 6th. We all know it was the most violent attack on our nation's capital since the War of 1812. It was the first time in our nation's history that the United States failed to enjoy a peaceful transfer of power. Well, actually, that's not true. Sometimes, and I've said that before, and I want to correct that for a second. Ronald Reagan, everybody likes to quote Ronald Reagan. After January 6th, everybody liked to throw Ronald Reagan at Republicans because in his first inaugural address, Ronald Reagan said the following, quote, the orderly transfer of authority has called for in the Constitution routinely takes place, as it has for almost 2 centuries. And few of us stop to think how unique we really are. In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle, unquote. Right? So that got played a lot after January 6th. Yeah, Ronald Reagan celebrated the peaceful transfer of power that Trump destroyed the record. We had a nearly 240-year record of peaceful transfers of power. Yeah, well, what Reagan left out was Abraham Lincoln was elected on November 6, 1860, and before Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, 7 southern states had already seceded from the Union. So not exactly a peaceful transfer of power, but why would Reagan bring up the old Confederacy when you just won pretty much the entire old Confederacy by running one of the most racist campaigns in modern American history? Even his own son, Ron Jr., said his father was a racist. He said, I love my father. He was a racist. It was on a Showtime special that they did about 3 years ago. He was a racist. The point is, though, our nation, since its founding, has enjoyed a peaceful transfer of power, except for the Civil War and January 6th, which we're now discovering was, for some, the first shot in our nation's second Civil War. Some believe we are in the midst of a second Civil War that began on January 6th. We do know, but for the patriotism of one man, the odious Vice President Mike Pence, who refused Trump's order to not certify the election for Joe Biden, we know January 6th, but for Mike Pence, would have spiraled into where we are at this moment tonight, on the brink of a complete and total takeover of our federal government by right-wing authoritarians who don't believe the American people are entitled to and capable of self-rule. Now, people don't like to talk about this because it's alarming. But just below the surface, and it's unreported by the mainstream media, just below the surface right now is an undergirding of intellectual heft, making the case against democracy, making the case for a benign dictator bolstered by an aristocracy of merit, where our nation's biggest and smallest decisions are made not by the people, but by a meritocracy comprised of only our best and our brightest. Now, part of why the rich and powerful want you and me fighting against each other is so we are trained to detest our fellow citizens so much that we no longer believe they can be trusted with the vote. How many times have you come home from a Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas and said, I can't believe that person is allowed to vote? This is part of the plan to divide us. The more divided we are, the less we trust our fellow citizen, and the less we trust our fellow citizen, the less we trust democracy. And that's what the rich and powerful want. They don't like democracy. They don't like unions because that's democracy. They don't like shareholders. That's why Zuckerberg owns 51% of Facebook. You know, shareholders have no say in these corporations because they don't like democracy. The constant division, the fighting, the arguing just for argument's sake, that's to debase the public square so that most Americans feel nothing but contempt for ordinary Americans. And they come to realize only the extraordinary Americans know what's best for us. And we are beginning to see, bubbling to the surface, books, articles, journals, websites, well-respected scholars providing the intellectual, theoretical heft necessary to justify the dismantling of our democracy. And that is what we're up against tonight. We have now an entire party, the Republican Party, is run by people who just don't hate big government. They hate self-rule. And if you don't know this, well, you're not paying close attention to who this Republican Party has become under Donald Trump. They do not want you to vote. It's why Donald Trump tonight is pushing so hard for the SAVE Act. The SAVE Act passed in the House earlier this year. It's tied up in the Senate. I don't know. It's not likely going to pass in the Senate because Republicans need 60 votes to overcome the filibuster. Republicans make the SAVE Act sound so innocent and anodyne, patriotic and harmless. All we're asking is, before you cast a ballot in person or by mail, you simply prove you're an American citizen. What's wrong with that? I don't know. How about everything? This is a solution in search of a problem. Republicans love the solution. The solution is forcing everyone in America to prove they're a U.S. citizen. Why do they love that solution? Because a lot of people can't prove they're citizens, even though they are. See, it costs money to prove you're a citizen. And if you're a woman who changed your name after you got married and then got divorced, good luck getting your name returned to the voting rolls. You may not want to admit this, but Republicans don't want women voting. There was just an interview with Pastor Doug, Pete Hegseth's spiritual guide, who said women should not be allowed to vote. They don't believe women should be allowed to vote. This is not hyperbole. It's not hyperbole. They don't want women to vote. So they're glad that it's hard for divorced women to get their name back on the voter rolls. Plus, it costs money to prove you're a U.S. citizen. As I've mentioned on the show, I'm currently in the process of renewing my passport, and it's costing me several $100s. But I need it because it's proof of citizenship. And you know what isn't proof of citizenship under the SAVE Act? A driver's license, because a lot of states issue driver's licenses to immigrants. So I've been over this before, but they're pushing the SAVE Act, a solution in search of a problem. And I want you to think right now, do you have proof that you're a citizen? Do you have a passport? How many Americans have passports? Has it been renewed? Do you have your birth certificate? Hey, don't go looking for it. Let me answer that one for you. You do not have your birth certificate. And if you do, there's something seriously wrong with your sense of self-worth. If you need a birth certificate because you need to prove to yourself you actually exist, you need medication. You do not have a birth certificate. Nobody has a birth certificate. And if you do have your birth certificate, you need to take a long look in the mirror. Do you have a government-issued real ID? That's what it's called. Do you know where to get a government-issued real ID? Better yet, do you even know what a government-issued real ID is? Do you? Of course not. Unless, of course, you're Hispanic or Latino or a person of color. So, again, a solution in search of a problem. They want to make it impossible for you to vote because by doing so, by demanding proof of citizenship, you are disproportionately favoring those with the money to pay for the documents necessary to prove you're a citizen. And those people are more likely to vote than Republican. The people who have the money, the means to prove that they're U.S. citizens tend to be Republican. So this amounts to a poll tax, which is against the law. Now, as I said, it's a solution in search of a problem. It doesn't matter that the Cato Institute, as well as the Heritage Foundation, these are two Koch brothers funded think tanks. The Heritage Foundation gifted us Project 2025 and the Brennan Center. Every study on this subject shows that non-citizens voting isn't a problem. It doesn't exist. But Republicans, they can't stop loving the solution. So they have to insist there's a problem. The Heritage Foundation, the people who gave us Project 2025, they wanted to find massive evidence of voter fraud. So they poured over the billions of ballots cast in every federal election since the year 2000. And they found anywhere between 20 to 70 instances of where maybe a non-citizen voted or tried to vote in a federal election. And usually they flagged it, the voting officials flagged it so they weren't allowed to vote. So the Brennan Center did the math on this. billions of ballots cast since the year 2000, 20 to 70 non-citizens possibly voting or trying to vote. What does that come out to? Well, if you go by the high end and you say it's 70, and that all of them voted, but all of them didn't vote, most of them were just flagged trying to vote. But if you're going to be generous and say 70 non-citizens, since the year 2000, out of the billions of ballots cast, 70 non-citizens voted. What does that come out to? Well, the Brennan Center did the math, and it comes out to about 0.0001% of all the billions of ballots cast since the year 2000. The percentage of ballots cast by non-citizens voting or trying to vote is about 0.0001%. What does the about in about 0.0001% mean? It means, well, it could be 0.0002%. That would be on the high end. Or on the low end, it would be what's less than 0.0001%? Zero. Nothing. Now, if you're not a citizen, I don't think you should be allowed to vote. And when we hold federal elections, let's say there is a 0.0001% chance that a non-citizen will try and possibly succeed in casting a ballot. That would be wrong. Don't want that to happen. But a society would be paralyzed if we weren't willing to live with a little risk. You know, you run a store, there's going to be a little shoplifting. That's the price you pay. We don't outlaw cars, even though there are hundreds of thousands of accidents each year, resulting in tens of thousands of fatalities. We don't outlaw guns, even though they're the leading cause of death for children. What we try to do is mitigate the risk, but we are willing to live with some risk. When we get on a plane, for example, despite all the safety precautions, there's still a chance we're not going to land where they say we will, like on land. There's a chance you might not land on land. So, like I said, there is some risk a non-citizen will vote or try to vote. The risk is 0.0001%, we think. Okay, as a nation, we have limited time, limited money, limited resources. How much effort should our federal government put into this non-existent problem? How many billions of dollars, how many wasted hours should be spent on this non-existent problem? If you're Donald Trump, if you're this Republican Party, you believe we should be spending more money and time on non-citizens voting, an imaginary problem. We should be spending more on that instead of real, actual problems like food insecurity, homelessness, unaffordable housing, crumbling infrastructure, and overcrowded schools. Or maybe increasing the inspections of our lettuce so we don't have an outbreak of explosive Trump. So why are we spending billions? Why the SAVE Act? They don't want you to vote. They want to make it impossible for you to vote because they don't believe in self-rule. That's what the SAVE Act is about. And they want every American to prove they're citizens, which very few Americans can. Can you prove you're a citizen? Do you have that passport? Is it renewed? You have a birth certificate? Do you have a real ID? I don't know what a real ID is. Let me assure you, you cannot prove you're an American citizen immediately. Eventually, but not immediately. And I know if you're white, if you don't speak with an accent, you're thinking, well, of course I'm an American citizen, right? Of course I am. This administration has made it very clear that out of the 360 million people living here, 100 million don't belong. This Justice Department is currently running a denaturalization pilot program where U.S. attorneys' offices around the country are in the process of attempting to strip the citizenship of undesirables. Because Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, all the way down to that wee bit of a half-man Greg Bovino, they say there's an enemy within. And it comes out to about 100 million. 100 million who either need to be thrown out of the country or locked up. That's the number, 100 million. Greg Bovino put it at 100 million. Department of Homeland Security under Kristi Noem put it at 100 million. Famous tweet of a beautiful beach that's empty. And the tweet was, America minus 100 million. How are they going to do that? How are they going to do that? Well, as I said earlier, Marco Rubio and Stephen Miller Thursday convened a meeting of 67 foreign ministers from around the world to draw attention to what they call the biggest threat on the planet: far left terror, specifically Antifa, which doesn't exist. Doesn't matter if it doesn't exist. Antifa, just like non-citizens voting, is a solution in search of a problem. Antifa doesn't exist. But if you can convince enough people that Antifa is a foreign terrorist organization, which Marco Rubio officially designated it as such back in September, if you can designate Antifa a foreign terrorist organization, even though it doesn't exist, then Donald Trump can command the Department of Homeland Security, especially those little men from ICE. They can then detain anyone suspected of harboring ties and or an affinity for Antifa. You know, like my father, who fought in World War II. If you're against fascism, like Beto Corral, the Colombian we just threw out of the country, if you're against fascism, you are now considered sympathetic to Antifa, which is now designated as a foreign and domestic terrorist organization. One of the very first things Donald Trump did as president was sign an executive order designating Antifa, which doesn't exist, as a domestic terrorist organization. Now, you see, I gave you the list, just a couple of the people Marco Rubio threw out of the country based solely on their Antifa politics. I gave you the list of some of the fascist authoritarians this administration supports. So if you're against fascism, and again, fascism is not Hitler. It's not even Mussolini. Fascism is a viable option. Fascism works. It does. It can last 17 years like it did in Chile. It lasted for close to 9 years in Argentina. We've seen it work in Honduras, El Salvador. It works. It's a choice. And you know who has supported fascism throughout the 20th and 21st century in Central and South America? The United States. We're the biggest backers of fascist regimes. We like fascism. We support fascism, United States. We don't support left-wing governments. Somoza we support, not the Sandinistas, Somoza. So if you're against fascism, this administration is making it very clear that if you believe in democratic self-rule, you're harboring thoughts that are akin to supporting domestic and foreign terrorist organizations like Antifa, which doesn't exist. Keep telling you this. Hitler never broke any laws. You have to establish legal precedents, building blocks. It's all legal. Now, getting arrested for being Antifa wouldn't hold up in court for the time being. But the Department of Homeland Security under Donald Trump has become a law to itself. They don't need judicial warrants. They can use administrative warrants, which I've gone over on the show countless times, which is why Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries shut the government down, partly over administrative warrants. What is an administrative warrant? Go back and listen to my shows, but it's basically it's permission for ICE or Border Patrol to kick open your door without a judicial warrant, just an official-looking piece of paper called an administrative warrant that was signed by some douchebag who works for the Department of Homeland Security. Not even Greg Bovino. Some douchebag 10 links down the chain of command. Anybody in a supervisory position at ICE can sign a official-looking document. Here you go. Kick open their door. Kick open your door, not just an undocumented immigrant, your door, an American citizen's door. And what happens when they kick open your door? The white, English-speaking citizen. What happens if they kick open your door? Because maybe, you are against fascism and you're suddenly, for some reason, your door get kicked open. Well, they're not going to arrest you for being Antifa. That's kind of stupid for the time being, right? All they have to say is, proof of citizenship, please. Where are your papers? Where are your papers? Show me your papers. So, if somebody breaks into your home, ICE, whomever, and puts a gun to your head and says, show me proof of your citizenship, can you come up with it? No, you can't. You can't. You don't have proof, you white POS with no accent who isn't really paying too close attention because it can't happen to me. Well, it can if you harbor political beliefs that are deemed un-American. So to all you white POSs who think, yeah, it's kind of sad, but, what are you going to do? Listen to me, douchebag. Can you prove you're a citizen? Well, sure you can eventually, but you know what? Come with me. That's how it works. That's how it works. You go to a for-profit detention facility. And then what happens? Well, they move you from one for-profit detention facility to another. That's how they operate. We saw it with Pedro Corral, the Colombian dissident who is now being sent back to Colombia. They moved him from in 2 weeks, he went to 6 separate ICE detention facilities. Why? Why do they do that? Well, it's so his friends, family, and lawyer can't find him. It's also because it's cruel, and we have a for-profit detention network that double dips. So if you spend the morning in a for-profit detention facility owned by Geo Group, and then you spend the early afternoon in one owned by Core Civic, and then later that night run by a mom and pop for-profit detention center. And yes, there are mom and pop for-profit detention facilities. Everybody you get to double, triple dip. You could be in 3 separate for-profit detention centers in one day, and everybody gets paid. That's what you're going to go through until you can prove that you're an American citizen. And you're not going to be allowed to make a phone call or see a lawyer. And even if you can, these detention facilities, they make it impossible for the lawyers to see their clients. That's how it goes. That's how it always goes. And I'm not talking about Nazi Germany. Stop thinking about the Holocaust. And this isn't Nazi Germany. This is Chile. We've seen this is stuff that is happening now and has happened since the dawn of the 20th century in Central and South America. And it's the United States that bankrolled all of it. Forget Hitler. Trump isn't Hitler. He's not smart enough. He's a right-wing authoritarian thug in the model of Somoza, a tool of the industrialists. Stop thinking Hitler. It's happened before in our hemisphere. It's happening now in our hemisphere. And it's going to be very easy for it to happen here. It's going to be effortless for Trump. As long as, rich people are stupid because they're content, they don't pay attention, they have nothing to worry about. And they always think, well, can't happen. I'm in a gated community. And then one day that gated community is a prison because you have some thoughts that are not acceptable. It's what a Kavanaugh stop is. That's what a Kavanaugh stop is. Now, he wrote last year that sometimes Americans will be rounded up based on their color, complexion, accent, clothing. He said, but all they have to do is prove they're U.S. citizens and they'll be released. That's what he put into writing. He said, yes, it's a minor inconvenience, but the odds, he said, of that happening are minuscule, and we have to be willing to live with a little risk that sometimes Americans get rounded up with non-citizens. Yeah, you have to be willing to live with a little risk. Unless it's a non-citizen voting or trying to vote, in which case we have to spend the gross national product of Portugal to prevent that from happening. So, again, the Kavanaugh stops, we've talked about it. This isn't just Donald Trump's end game. It's the end game for the entire Republican Party. And I'd say 4 out of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court, they want permanent rule, first by making it impossible to vote, and then by making it unnecessary to vote because Trump invoked the Insurrection Act and suspended the elections. This is the Mop Up. I'm David Feldman in New York City. Thank you for joining me. Please like this episode and share it. And as you know, they're throttling me back. So I have a website. You can join my fan club. I have a fan club for special messages. You can get my newsletter over at my website. I don't bother you much if you sign up for my newsletter. We're going to be having some Zoom meetups. If you want to support the show, there are ways you can follow me for free on Patreon. If you want to pay on Patreon or you just want to donate, it's all there on my website. Join the fan club because it's stupid. That's and check out my merch. Please do that. Okay. I'm going to keep going. Anybody still here? Like it matters? Nobody's here, so I'm not going to do the show. I do this show for myself. I'm one of those people you see on the street talking to themselves. I like to think when I do it, it might be interesting to others, but I'm just a crazy person talking to himself. So I don't need people listening to this show. I'm going to do it either way. And by the way, there are no premium episodes. People are saying, well, you should charge for a few I believe all information should be free. And if you can pay for it, then, but you're not any better than the people who can't. In fact, you're worse. So if you donate to my show, go F yourself. Why aren't I successful? Why can't I make it? All right. What was I talking about? I had a point, I think. I think I had a point. Okay. Donald Trump this week finally paid E. Jean Carroll the more than $5 million he owed her after a jury ruled in 2023 that he sexually abused and then defamed her. We know E. Jean Carroll claimed Trump forced his penis into her, but the jury said she couldn't prove that. Instead, they ruled he used another appendage, and because of New York law at the time, he could only be found liable for sexual abuse and not rape. The judge in that trial put into writing that the jury, he put this into writing twice, that this jury found Trump civilly liable for rape in common law parlance because throughout parts of the world and throughout the United States, the law often makes no distinction between which appendages are inserted against a woman's will. Doesn't have to be the penis. Just as no means no, rape is rape. But at the time of the trial in New York, rape wasn't always rape. New York has since changed the law after E. Jean Carroll, but when the jury came back with their decision, they found Donald Trump civilly liable for sexual abuse. So that's okay, right? It's only sexual abuse. What's wrong with that? Why is she so upset? Why are people so upset with Donald Trump? It wasn't rape, at least not in New York. It was only sexual abuse, which I've heard people tell me that. It's just sexual abuse. Just sexual abuse, wasn't rape. And so Donald Trump sued ABC News for $15 million because George Stephanopoulos said on his Sunday show that a jury found Trump civilly liable for rape instead of saying for sexual abuse. So a lot of this stuff comes furiously at you, and it's hard to process. So I want you to think about this for a second. ABC News' parent company, Disney, ended up cutting a check for $15 million last year to settle Trump's defamation lawsuit because George Stephanopoulos said it was rape and not sexual abuse. $15 million. ABC News settled. That's 3 times what the jury ordered Trump to pay E. Jean Carroll for sexually abusing and then defaming her. So, in a way, ABC kind of paid that settlement for Trump and then some. I know it's going to his library, and so is the new Air Force One from Qatar. It's all going to his library. Sure it is. Now, there's another $90 million judgment that E. Jean Carroll won. We're still waiting for the Supreme Court to decide whether or not they'll take Trump's appeal. But just stop, okay? Think about this. A jury said Donald Trump sexually abused E. Jean Carroll. Today, they would have ruled he raped her. They changed the definition of rape. Trump refused to pay her, and while refusing to pay her, got $15 million from ABC, claiming George Stephanopoulos defamed him by failing to make the distinction between sexual abuse and rape. That became the issue. Not that a jury found Donald Trump civilly liable for sexual abuse. Not that the state of New York made a distinction between sexual abuse and rape, and what's that all about? No, that conversation didn't take place because ABC settled. They didn't want to have that conversation. It's Disney. We don't want the kids to hear that that sexual abuse and rape are the same thing. That we're Disney. We'll just settle and make it go away. Trump, because this is how predators function, became the victim. People think he's a genius. Look how he changed the conversation. He's like Don Draper in Mad Men. If you don't like what you're being accused of, change the conversation. That's not genius. That's part of the pathology. After you are caught, even found civilly liable, the pathology dictates that instead of paying the judgment, instead of trying to make amends, you dig in your heels and claim, I'm the injured party. You accused me of rape. It was only sexual abuse. Only sexual abuse. Try that if you're out on a date. Say, I was only convicted of sexual abuse. It was not rape, it was sexual abuse. Can Can I see you again? Donald Trump's the victim, not a genius. This is part of the sickness. When an abusive father beats his children, the last thing he says is, "Why do you make me do this? Why do you make me do this? You think I enjoy doing this? I hate it, but you refuse to behave." And then maybe he'll cry, and the child who just got beaten is convinced they're to blame, not just for the beating, but for making the abuser, daddy, feel horrible for having to beat them. It's how pimps work. It's how your boss works. Why do you make me yell at you? This isn't genius. It's part of the pathology. Trump is just operating on instinct. So after January 6th, Trump needed to rewrite history. And this is what his speech is about and what you're going to be hearing in the lead up to the midterms, which look like it's not going to be good for the Republicans. And if he loses the Senate or the House, you know how bad things can get for him. So he's desperate. And this is about rewriting history right now. And what he does and has done since January 6th in order to rehabilitate his image, he has done what all abusers do instinctively. You claim to be the victim. I never did anything wrong. I'm the victim of a weaponized justice system. Now, if you're a low information voter, a Republican, you fall prey to conspiracy theories because conspiracy theories don't require nuance, understanding, or the heavy lifting of intellectual rigor. Conspiracy theories are nicely tied up, packaged answers for things there aren't necessarily an answer for. You know, God is a conspiracy theory. And right now, and this is really important, inside a federal courtroom down in Florida, away from the eyes of the world, there is a U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of Florida, in and around Miami. It's led by a Trump-appointed U.S. Attorney by the name of Jason Redding Quinones. He and his staffers are presenting evidence to a grand jury. And his office is attempting to prove what is being called inside the Trump White House, and those who are following this, they're trying to prove what is called the grand conspiracy. The grand conspiracy. Have you been following this? Now, I've talked about it a little. 100 subpoenas have been issued in this investigation into the grand conspiracy. Some of those subpoenas are so riddled with errors and nonsense, they've been marked down to invitations to testify. But they've been handed out to countless people inside the Obama and Biden Justice Departments and intelligence agencies. It's all part of Trump's Department of Justice, attempting to create the illusion that every single criminal probe into Donald Trump, every civil lawsuit filed against Donald Trump, all flowed from a massive conspiracy beginning with the Obama administration's deep, dark state. It was all part of a plan to discredit and then destroy Donald Trump before, during, and after his first term as president. And this conspiracy went the IRS was part of it. When his tax returns were leaked to the press in 2019, showing he doesn't have any money and he doesn't pay taxes. Russiagate, so the grand conspiracy goes, was a product of the Obama administration. That's what Trump and his Justice Department is setting out to prove, that he didn't collude with Russia in order to win in 2016, and that Putin didn't interfere with that election so Trump would win. According to the grand conspiracy, Robert Mueller, the Mueller report, James Comey, even Marco Rubio, who was then the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, they all concluded after hearings, grand jury testimony, investigations, they all concluded, including Marco Rubio as chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, he put together a report concluding that Vladimir Putin interfered on behalf of Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election. All of them, including Marco Rubio, again, the Senate Intelligence Committee he was chair of, issued a report saying that Putin interfered in 2016 on behalf of Trump. All of them were in on a grand conspiracy to destroy Donald Trump. All of them. Doesn't matter. They're all in on it. All of them. John Durham, you might remember, was the special counsel appointed by then Attorney General Bill Barr to look into the Mueller report during the first Trump presidency. He was ordered to pore over and discover misconduct in Operation Crossfire Hurricane, which is what the FBI initially called its Russiagate investigation. According to the grand conspiracy, special counsel John Durham, Republican, appointed by a Republican attorney general in a Republican presidential administration, Trump's, he turned out to be a part of the grand conspiracy because his nearly 4-year investigation concluded there was no grand conspiracy against Donald Trump, and that except for basically one altered email in order to renew a FISA warrant on Carter Page, the entire Operation Crossfire Hurricane investigation was flawless. I know. The people say there were other flaws, not criminal flaws. And because of Donald Trump's pathology, he won't leave it alone. Most of you have forgotten about Russiagate, but he has ordered his Justice Department down in Miami, far from the probing media, to create a paper trail that suggests James Comey, a Republican, and Robert Mueller, another Republican, conspired with Democrats to make it look like Putin interfered in 2016 on behalf of Trump, that they were all in on it. Now, the Mueller report, you might remember he died this year, and Trump said, good riddance. The Mueller report said that despite Trump campaign officials holding high-level meetings with Putin associates inside Trump Tower, there didn't seem to be enough evidence to suggest that the Trump campaign was actively colluding with Putin. That, he said, we cannot prove. So the Mueller report said two things. One, that Vladimir Putin actively worked to throw the 2016 election in favor of Donald Trump because Putin believed Hillary Clinton as Obama's Secretary of State, proved herself a strong ally of Ukraine and an even stronger proponent for containing Putin's expansionist ambitions. So he wanted Trump. The Mueller report also concluded that Trump could be tried and convicted for obstruction of justice. That's part 2 of the Mueller report. It is a blueprint for how to prosecute Trump for obstruction of justice, specifically centering around Trump's attempts to first dissuade FBI Director James Comey from looking into Russiagate and then firing him because he wouldn't stop. So Mueller said, this is how you could prosecute Trump, adding, but we don't prosecute sitting presidents, based on a Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel memo saying that. It was written during the Nixon administration. The Justice Department made it official policy, we don't prosecute sitting presidents. And the Justice Department has been working off that memo, and now the Supreme Court ruling, which is still a little vague. Anyway, Trump, grand conspiracy theory, Mueller, James Comey, John Durham, all part of the grand conspiracy, even though they probably voted for Trump in 2016 because they're Republicans. According to the grand conspiracy, the deep, dark state's attempt to destroy Donald Trump went far beyond all the successful prosecutions of Trump White House officials, successful prosecutions, including Trump himself. That Alvin Bragg, who succeeded in making Donald Trump a convicted felon, was part of the grand conspiracy. It extended down to the states and the cities. New York State Attorney General Letitia James was part of the deep, dark state and the grand conspiracy when she sued Trump and won after charging the then president, this was in 2019, with defrauding donors to his phony charity. So he's forbidden from running a charity or holding a charitable event in New York State, and he had to pay restitutions to some of the charities he robbed. That was in 2019. He settled that lawsuit. According to the grand conspiracy, Letitia James was working in the service of the deep, dark state. Nobody will tell us what the deep, dark state is. She was in the service of the deep, dark state and the grand conspiracy when she sued and won in her lawsuit, charging Trump with defrauding lenders to the tune of $500 million. Remember that? 2024. Deep, dark state. That was deep, dark state. The deep, dark state, it reached all the way down to the Fulton County, Georgia District Attorney's Office, Fani Willis, who brought forth a RICO indictment charging Trump and I think 18 others with attempting to steal the 2020 presidential election in Georgia. Deep, dark state. All part of the grand conspiracy. Remember that phone call Trump made to Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, a Republican who voted for Trump in the 2020 election? You've heard the tape. I'm not going to play it. On January 2nd, 2021, Trump is heard on tape, dead to rights, cajoling, urging, and then threatening Georgia's top election official, the state attorney, the state secretary of state. He says, and I quote, "I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have." He said, fellas, I need 11,000 votes here. Give me a break. And then advising Raffensperger on how to spin it. Quote, "There's nothing wrong with saying that you've recalculated. You've heard the tape. 40 minutes of him making the case for Georgia's Secretary of State to declare Trump, not Joe Biden, the winner. Trump then threw the weight of his entire Justice Department behind a threat to prosecute Raffensperger, Secretary of State of Georgia. He said if he didn't find the votes, you're going to get prosecuted. It's on tape. Trump said, and I quote, "It is more illegal for you than it is for them because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense, and you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk. I'm notifying you that you're letting it happen." So Donald Trump calls himself the chief law enforcement officer in the country because the DOJ answers to him. That is a threat to prosecute Brad Raffensperger for not switching the win column over to Trump. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Fani Willis, the Georgia DA who brought forth the RICO indictments, partly based on that phone call, had Donald Trump dead to rights. There was no way Trump could ever let this thing go to trial. That phone call itself was the smoking gun. There was no way Donald Trump could let that go to trial. And it didn't go to trial because by the time Trump won in November of 2024, Trump's lawyers got Fani Willis thrown off the case over a bogus, improper relationship with her lead prosecutor in the case. The RICO indictments eventually got turned over to a Republican state prosecutor who said last year that Georgia lacked the time and money to prosecute a sitting U.S. president. They have the time and money to make sure undocumented immigrants who don't vote in elections don't vote in elections. That they have the time and money to make it impossible for U.S. citizens not to vote, but they don't have the time and money to prosecute a sitting U.S. president for something as anodyne as trying to overturn the election. So the case was dropped last year. No trial, because there couldn't be. The same way there couldn't be a trial down in Florida after special counsel Jack Smith also had Donald Trump dead to rights. He had no problem, Jack Smith, convincing a grand jury in Florida to indict Donald Trump for violating the Espionage Act after Trump refused to turn over classified documents. Here, too, we had a slam dunk. Even Trump's former Attorney General Bill Barr said the preponderance of evidence shows Trump is guilty of violating the Espionage Act. They even had Trump on tape. Again, caught on tape, this time at his Bedminster Country Club, showing off to complete strangers classified war plans for an invasion of Iran. This was a layup for special counsel Jack Smith. So just to be sporting, Smith brought the case down to Miami, Trump's backyard. He could have filed the case before a Washington, D.C. grand jury, but he figured, I got the January 6th case in Washington, D.C. And this one, the classified material, is a slam dunk. Let's be sporting and let's do it in Trump's backyard. Let's work for this one because it's just too easy. Well, the judge in that case ended up being a Trump appointee named Eileen Cannon, who ended up throwing the classified documents case out 2 weeks after the Supreme Court's 2024 immunity ruling. She cited a concurrent opinion in that decision written by Clarence Thomas, who merely raised the question about the constitutionality of a special counsel. He said, maybe we should look into whether or not the job of special counsel is unconstitutional. Maybe it violates our Constitution's appointments clause, which indirectly mandated that all top attorneys inside the Justice Department must be nominated and then confirmed by the Senate. Thomas wrote, maybe the special counsel's office needs to be created by Congress, and the occupant of that office must be confirmed by the Senate. Maybe we should talk about that. Because Jack Smith, the special counsel office, is just set up by the Attorney General, and the Attorney General gets to pick the special counsel, doesn't have to be confirmed by the Senate like all other U.S. attorneys must. That was merely a question Thomas raised. But Eileen Cannon, a Trump appointee, threw out the entire classified documents case, ruling that special counsel Jack Smith, his position as special counsel, was unconstitutional. And what was her legal precedent? Clarence Thomas writing, maybe we should discuss whether perhaps. So Jack Smith was in the process of appealing Eileen Cannon's ruling when Trump won in November, and then he just dissolved his office, and Trump never went on trial. But like the Georgia RICO trial, there could never be one. They had Trump dead to rights on violating the Espionage Act. He had to figure out a way to get it thrown out on a bogus technicality. And Eileen Cannon came through. And you know who the judge is? You know who's presiding over the grand conspiracy grand jury down in the Southern District of Florida? Eileen Cannon. Kind of feels like Trump is right about there being a grand conspiracy, not against, but rather in favor of him. So that grand conspiracy grand jury will unlikely deliver any indictments, but it doesn't have to. That's not why they're doing it. It just has to create enough smoke so Americans think there's fire. The American people and our media lack the time and vocabulary to understand any of this. Any of this. For example, E. Jean Carroll sued Donald Trump for rape after New York passed the Adult Survivors Act in 2022, which created a 1-year look-back window, lifting the statute of limitations on any sexual crime, allowing victims to sue their abuser in civil court. So in 2022, she sued Donald Trump because he abused her. She said he raped her. The jury said he abused her in the 90s. Happened in the 90s. There was a statute of limitations, but she had 1 year starting on November 24th, 2022 to file her lawsuit. She filed that lawsuit on the very first day the window opened up. So that's a lot of information to process, right? Keep track. There are 2 trials. There's Carroll 1 and Carroll 2. Takes a lot of work to parse all this out. So when it's confusing, you can lie. Or you can make it about, I didn't rape her, I only abused her. In 2019, while Trump was president, she put into writing that Donald Trump raped her, and she left it at that. This was before New York passed the Adult Survivors Act in 2022, so she knew there was a statute of limitations. There was nothing she could do. So she just wanted the world to know Donald Trump raped me. Trump, as president, was asked about this, and he said, she's not my type. And he said something else. And so she decided to sue him for defamation. You can sue a president, sitting president, for defamation. That lawsuit is now part of what is called Carroll 2. That's the second jury decision awarding E. Jean Carroll close to $90 million if you include the interest. And the Supreme Court will decide sometime in the next year whether to hear Trump's appeal. But Carroll 1, which ended this week, that was the first civil lawsuit, and it was filed under the Adult Survivors Act. It's done, and Trump paid her the money. And in so doing, he blamed the weaponization of our Justice Department under Joe Biden, meaning E. Jean Carroll is part of the grand conspiracy against Donald Trump. Now, I could barely follow what I just told you. Imagine what a Republican believes. Yeah, that was the weaponization of the Justice Department, which had nothing to do with the E. Jean Carroll trial. Most Americans or Republicans don't know the difference between a civil lawsuit and a criminal lawsuit, a federal trial versus a state trial. Trump loves the uneducated, so he says, E. Jean Carroll, that whole thing, weaponized Justice Department, because he's never guilty. He's always the victim. In 2019, the deep dark state, deploying MK Ultra brainwashing techniques, convinced E. Jean Carroll she had been raped by Donald Trump. That's how it worked, right? And then 3 years later, the deep dark state tricked the deep blue state of New York into passing the Adult Survivors Act so E. Jean Carroll could sue Trump for rape in a civil court. That's the grand conspiracy. And the judge in that case, Lewis Kaplan, a Republican, a Reagan appointee, not only he, but the jury, they were all commandeered by the deep, dark state to find Donald Trump civilly liable for sexually abusing E. Jean Carroll. And then every appeals court, including the United States Supreme Court, they were all manipulated by the deep, dark state to force Donald Trump to pay Carroll more than $5 million. Grand conspiracy theory. They call it the grand conspiracy theory. I call it paranoid schizophrenia with delusions of grandeur. It couldn't be that Donald Trump sexually abused E. Jean Carroll. No, there's a grand conspiracy to destroy Donald Trump, and ABC News is in on it. And you know that. You know that ABC News is in on it because George Stephanopoulos said the jury found Trump civilly liable for rape, when in fact it was only sexual abuse. Only sexual abuse. What was sexual abuse? I mean, if we learned anything from the Vatican paying out hundreds of millions of dollars, sexual abuse, it's like rolling a stop sign by accident. You know, who's hurt by sexual abuse? Probably everybody who works in the Trump White House, whether they know it or not. there's some repressed memory going on. But Donald Trump was the victim. It was only sexual abuse. He was cleared, as a matter of fact, by that jury that told him to pay E. Jean Carroll $5 million. The jury said he only forced himself on top of E. Jean Carroll and sexually abused her against her will. It wasn't, they said it wasn't rape. He was only forcing himself on top of E. Jean Carroll and sexually abusing her. Wasn't rape. But George Stephanopoulos, who's in on the grand conspiracy, called it rape. But it wasn't. It's only sexual abuse. Meaning the real victim is Donald Trump. Donald Trump was the victim here, not E. Jean Carroll. Donald Trump's the victim. It was only sexual abuse. All he did was lay his big fat body on top of E. Jean Carroll against her will and insert something, and it was only abuse. Well, what Trump always does, we know this, he accuses others of his crimes. We know that Trump was the beneficiary of foreign interference in the 2016 presidential election. We know that. So he's claiming right now that he has evidence of foreign interference in the midterms, in the 2020 presidential election. What he's the beneficiary of, he accused others of being guilty of. So did he win because of Putin? No, but Putin played a part. Putin definitely played a part. And so did then FBI Director Jim Comey, who, while investigating Putin's interference in the 2016 election, decided to send a much publicized letter just 11 days before that big presidential election in 2016, informing Congress he was reopening his investigation into Hillary Clinton's private email server after he claimed new pertinent information had bubbled to the surface involving Huma Abedin, Clinton's assistant, and her then husband, disgraced Congressman Anthony Weiner. Remember this? So the election was 11 days away. Comey, a Republican, reopened the investigation into Clinton's email server because Huma Abedin's husband, Anthony Weiner, a month earlier, had his laptop and electronic devices seized by the FBI because he was suspected of sexting with a minor. Comey went public with it. And because that's the story the American people can understand. Hillary Clinton used a private email server. Huma Abedin's husband was caught sexting with the teenager. Huma Abedin works for Hillary. So we better reopen the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server, and we should tell the world that we've reopened the investigation just days before the presidential election while Americans are filling out their mail-in ballots and in some states already voting. Comey, at the same time, Jim Comey, felt no need to inform Congress that at the very same time, he was also investigating Russia's interference on behalf of Donald Trump in that election. Well, why didn't he go public that he was investigating Vladimir Putin and the Trump campaign for collusion and possible election interference? Oh, because the director of the FBI, the FBI, law enforcement never announce an investigation has been opened or has been closed, or that it even existed. We're not supposed to know when somebody is being investigated because it is the job of the FBI to investigate, but unless they have enough evidence to secure an indictment, they never make announcements about investigations. It's the job of the U.S. attorney to unseal the indictments. It's not the job of the FBI director to declare we're investigating Donald Trump and his campaign for possible collusion with Putin. You don't do that. The FBI director never, ever announces an ongoing or closed investigation unless it results in an indictment, and that's the job of the U.S. attorney, not the FBI director. You don't do that because it contaminates the evidence. FBI director never announces that an investigation has been opened or closed because you've contaminated the evidence as well as the reputation of the individual under investigation, especially when nothing was found. You don't do it except when it comes to Hillary Clinton. See, you don't announce you're investigating the Trump campaign for collusion with Putin. You don't want to contaminate the investigation, and you don't want to ruin a man's reputation, and you certainly don't make that announcement while people are voting. Unless it's Hillary Clinton, who has an assistant married to a congressman who's been possibly sexting with a teenager. Then you have to announce while people are voting that we've reopened an investigation which did not result in an indictment. There was smoke. There was smoke. Comey provided enough smoke, no fire, just enough smoke, so some people who were on the fence when it came to Hillary, they stayed home on Election Day. So, despite Trump trying to lock up Jim Comey right now, despite Trump accusing Comey of being part of the grand conspiracy, the truth is Jim Comey was just as much responsible as Putin was for Trump winning in 2016, and maybe that's why Trump hates Comey. Trump, didn't expect to win. I don't think he wanted to win. I think the best thing that could have happened to Trump was losing to Hillary. I think that was the best case scenario, being the guy who almost became president. Because nobody ever pulled off what he did, almost becoming president, with zero background in politics and government. Had he lost, the world would have been his. Instead, he won, and then it was like Robert Redford at the end of The Candidate. Now what? Now what do we do? Well, now Trump has to stay inside the Oval Office. He cannot leave. And you have to claim foreign interference. You have to claim America's free and fair elections are at stake. You have to create some sort of national emergency. So just enough people lose faith in any Democratic member of Congress who wins in November. You need to convince enough American people that should the Democrats win the midterms, then the new Congress, sworn in on January 3rd, 2027, Well, they're as illegitimate as Joe Biden was on January 6, 2021, and we know what happened that day. It's a little different. It's going to be a little different this time. Nobody stands up to Trump. There's nobody left in the party or in the executive branch to stand up to Trump the way there was on January 6, 2021. He doesn't have to prove election fraud. Same way he doesn't need to prove the 2020 presidential election was stolen, but he's setting out to prove the 2020 election was stolen because he's trying to set a predicate that he was cheated out of the presidency in 2020, so he's entitled to run again. You don't need to prove Hillary Clinton had broken the law with her private email server. You just need to create smoke. Thick smoke that nobody can see through, that nobody understands or even cares to understand. Because people believe what they want to believe. In 2016, people were looking for an excuse not to vote for Hillary, and Comey served it up. And on January 6th, there were enough people in this country who saw the Capitol getting ransacked, then looked at their own lives and thought, F Nancy Pelosi, she deserves this. And what Trump is doing right now, by still insisting the 2020 election was stolen, he deflects from his own crime and plays the victim. Right? The same way he got triple the money from ABC News that he was supposed to pay E. Jean Carroll by making it about, I'm just an abuser, not a rapist. Trump, right now, is turning our attention away from January 6th, away from the insurrection, by digging in his heels and presenting more evidence that the 2020 election was stolen. And the more you convince people the 2020 election was stolen, the more you convince them he was right for pardoning all those armed goons who stormed the Capitol that day. Because if the 2020 presidential election really was stolen, well, as the man said, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. If you can convince enough people the 2020 election was stolen, you can get them to believe that January 6th was a reasonable response. I'm afraid this is war, and like all wars, it's all based on a lie. There are, he's waging war on our democracy, and you have to vote. You got to be peaceful. You don't want to get arrested. You do not want to get arrested. It's okay to protest, but don't do anything stupid. Contact your member of Congress and vote for Democrats. Even if it's Josh Gottheimer, vote for the Democrats. Vote for the Democrats. Don't give this regime any excuse or reason to arrest you. Peace. You got to be peaceful and follow the letter of the law and be able to prove you're a citizen. Renew your passport if you can afford it. Get a real ID. Get your papers in order. I'm David Feldman, reminding you to stay strong and protect the weak. Thank you for listening to me. If you enjoyed any of this, and I have no idea why you would, please like it, share it. Join my fan club. I have a fan club. It's not the dumbest thing I've ever done, but actually it's not even close to the dumbest thing I've ever done. But join my fan club, sign up for my newsletter. What else? What are you supposed to do? Check merch and donate and share and all that stuff. All right. My next show is Sunday night at 6:05 p.m. Thank you to Bob and Mila in the chat room.